What structural changes do people in HR and transformation teams need to take into account about the new amendment? The act was gazetted, last week on the 15th of April. So, what do they mean by gazetted, and what does that do for enforcement timelines?
There are three pieces of transformation legislation that sit in different departments, but are ultimately all integrated.
Okay.
So the first one is
Welcome to another episode of Thooto Talks. I'm your host, Techa Sefoga, and today I'm joined by Lee, who's here to discuss the amendments of the Employment Equity Act. So Lee, just to start off, I want to understand, was there a need to repeal the previous Employment Equity Act, and in the sense of what gaps did the Department of Labor see?
Well, firstly, good to be back. Thanks. Always nice being with you guys. So I think the need for the new legislation stems from the fact that, in government's opinion, there hasn't been enough emphasis put on compliance. And there's certainly been the perception that many companies have been ticking boxes around employment equity and not necessarily doing all that they should to help drive transformation in South Africa.
And what do you believe what do you believe should happen?
Well, ultimately, what we would like to see ideally is the alignment of the demographic groups inside organizations, particularly at higher levels, matching more closely to that of the rest of the country. So, for example, the economically active population broadly across South Africa is it's about 80% black in total,
Yes.
right? So ultimately, the objective of government is that that alignment should be seen at the upper levels, not just at lower levels. However, having said that, government has given leeway in that, and it must be mentioned that the targets are not as severe as 80% at the upper levels, right? So as much as that is the broader economically active population for black people, and I'm just using broad numbers to help demonstrate the direction, some of the targets are not actually that difficult to reach. So they are made a little bit easier anyway.
And, what does the repeal, look like when it comes to compliance? Is it a complete redefinition?
So really what's changed is just that smaller companies no longer need to comply. So if you have less than 50 employees, you don't need to worry about compliance anymore. So that's great. So that's made it easier for smaller businesses. But larger businesses with 50 plus employees now need to comply. They've also done away with the thresholds. So there used to be a revenue threshold which would determine compliance. So either you had to have 50 employees or your industry sector had to reach a certain revenue threshold, and whichever of those came first meant that you'd have to comply. That no longer applies. Now you only need to comply if you have 50 employees and above, which I think many businesses are happy with. There are other changes that make it more difficult for companies to not be good corporate citizens, which is ultimately good for workers in general. But what I mean by that is you need a compliance certificate issued by the Department of Labor. Without that compliance certificate, you will not be able to do any business with government. So those are some of the things that, as much as I use the term make it more difficult, it probably is the right thing to do anyway.
Yes.
Because the compliance criteria, I think, are quite valuable. So, for example, if you've had any adverse labor court findings, if you're not paying minimum wage across your entire organization, if you've had sexual abuse claims inside your business, those are the issues that can negate your compliance certificate. Now, those are things companies should be dealing with properly anyway.
Yes.
So as much as I say it's more difficult, it is a good thing that some of these new requirements have kicked in.
Do you think it's something that was it high time? What do you think the pivotal moment was, or the pivotal realization that change was needed?
I think it comes down to the fact that many companies in South Africa tend to treat transformation as a tick box
Yeah.
exercise, and so they were not complying to the levels that they should. There was a lot of they're still lacking transformation at upper levels.
Yes.
Um, and what business needs to keep in mind is if government puts out a policy and you as business find loopholes around it, and you're not going to do your best to comply with it, government is then going to have an incentive to strengthen the policy, which
Mm,
is what
mm,
we've seen
mm,
happen now.
mm, mm.
Um, so business can fight it if they like, but the reality is South Africa is also not the only country in the world with this type of legislation that exists.
Okay,
People often
what other
forget.
country?
I've spent some time in the US prior to the current administration,
Okay.
and I can tell you that they have policies where if there's a certain higher concentration of black people in a certain area, then an infrastructure project has to use more black people and give them more opportunities. It's affirmative action.
Yes,
Basically,
yes,
that's
yeah,
what it
yeah.
is. People often don't realize that South Africa's BEE policy stems from Malaysia.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
The foundation of the policy was borrowed from the Malaysian model and adapted to suit our needs. If you want to do business in Dubai, you have to have 51% local ownership, or you cannot even consider it. Right. So people love to complain about South Africa's transformation policies, but some of those very people that complain about South Africa's policies go and meet those other policies in other countries.
And are we doing better than them or are they doing better than us?
I can't give you a global comparison. That's a very good question. And now that
Mm-hmm.
you've asked me that, I will go and research it later on because it would be nice to know,
Yeah, to
actually.
do like a whole comparative analysis
That
and
that would be an
the kind
interesting
of
one.
like loopholes within the auditing process and how they dealt with it and how we're dealing with it really. But I mean, did you say it was like successful, like their initiative for transformation?
Look, like any initiative and any policy, there are issues and problems. And I've been to Malaysia myself to go and explore and try to understand better on the ground. It's not without fault there either,
Oh, okay.
just like it's not without fault in South Africa. So, as much as I believe BE policies are well intentioned, we know that a lot of the criticism that BE receives is sometimes quite accurate,
Okay.
right? The problem, however, is that the positives that BE and employment equity, for example, achieve, nobody likes a good news story in the media, right?
Nobody likes it?
They don't like a good news story in the media.
Okay.
So if for a newspaper to sell, they've got to tell you all the fraud, the
So it has
corruption.
to be slanderous, basically.
Right. So the media is usually pretty good at using the negative incidents that come up around BE, of which, like I said, we don't dispute they exist,
Mm-mm.
but they never talk about the positives.
Okay.
And so the public impression created is this BE thing is useless, it's fraudulent. When you actually see the good it does, when you see the lives of people
That it
who
actually changes.
you will appreciate just how good it is on the ground when it's done properly.
And in your opinion, do the positives overwhelm the negatives, or is it vice versa?
I can't give you a technically accurate answer.
Okay.
I don't have data to support that.
Okay, that's fair.
You know, anecdotally, I would suggest that there's, in spite of there being theft that happens and comrades stealing money using BE as a front, I would say that if more people put more attention and energy into understanding the good and forcing politicians to use BE better, that would solve a lot of the problems and we'd have a good story to tell.
No, completely, completely. And the act was gazetted, last week on the 15th of April. So what do they mean by gazetted and what does that do for enforcement timelines?
Right. So gazetted basically means that as of that date, all the outstanding information like the targets, etc., that we've been waiting for are
Mm-mm.
now legally applicable.
Okay.
So prior to that, businesses knew broadly what the Act requirements were. That took effect on the 1st of January 2025, but we were waiting for the targets, which are the ones you just spoke about from
Mm-hmm.
last week. Now that that is out, now companies can go about implementing their employment equity requirements, their plans. Everybody's got to start with a brand new plan. Any employment equity plan you had before that is now null and void.
Oh,
You've
okay.
got to start from scratch with a new 5-year plan. Previously, you could decide on the duration of your plan, but now everybody's got to do a 5-year employment equity plan. Some businesses feel that the nature of their sector means and maybe there's too much volatility in their sector,
Yeah.
and some of them may feel that that's a little bit too long. But generally, the new targets or the new requirement is now 5 years, and you need to also try as hard as you can to comply with those new targets that have been gazetted, and they are sector specific this time. The targets also align with the EAP targets.
Okay.
That stands for
So it's
economically,
not arbitrary figures.
it stands for economically
Yeah.
active population.
Mm.
Um, I, it's not arbitrary in that Status A issues the EAP targets quarterly. However, there are some sectors that are very unhappy with the targets because they feel that it makes no sense for them in their particular sector. Now, in some cases, they may have a very justifiable reason
Yeah.
for that perspective. Um, in other cases, there's also the feeling that the Department of Labor did not, that they did the consultation process as a tick box exercise and not in a meaningful way. Now, the reality is, it doesn't matter which side you sit on, you're never going to get everybody happy in any policy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So there's always going to be somebody that's going to feel hard done by, and government's always going to feel like they gave too much leeway to business, right?
Mm-mm.
When you talk to both sides, that's always the case. It doesn't matter what your experience is in government policy. So I feel it for both sides because if I had to just sit in the middle and try to think about it objectively, you're never going to please everybody all of the time. However, I still strongly believe the government could have done a better job of that process
In
anyway.
what sense?
Better lead times, the consultation processes. For example, nobody in industry feels like any of their concerns were even factored in.
Was there no like meaningful engagement that took place?
Well, that's exactly the right word that you use, meaningful. And
Mm-mm.
that's the problem,
Mm.
is that most of industry felt that it wasn't meaningful. They felt like it was a tick box for the
Okay.
sake of being able to confirm that it was done. But
Mm-mm.
most of business felt it was not meaningful at all.
One thing I understand about, I'm not sure if my understanding of gazettes is accurate, but isn't there like a process where people have to like, sign before like an act gets amended or enacted? And were they not involved in that process?
So different departments and different pieces of legislation have different requirements. So, for example, I'll use a recent gazette that was released that was basically illegal, and it
Okay.
was by the health minister banning all cannabis and hemp products.
Okay.
Why that was illegal is that the health minister is required by law to consult
Yes.
for, I don't know if it was 30, 60, or 90 days, um, and then consider all of those consultations before issuing any new laws. There was no justification for issuing that gazette without consultation. Therefore, it was illegal, right?
Yes, yes.
That gazette has since been repealed.
Oh, okay.
But that aside, so there is a process in legislation for consultation, and that process exists here as well. But that goes back to your question about meaningful,
Mm-mm.
right? Business felt it wasn't meaningful and that it was just done as a tick box exercise.
Mm-mm.
Had they not consulted, they would not have been able to roll out the legislation because it would have been considered illegal.
Yes.
So technically, they protected themselves by ticking the boxes
Yeah.
and consulting as they can now say they did, even if business felt it wasn't meaningful.
No, I understand. And I guess that leads into my next question. So, what structural changes do people in HR and transformation teams need? What do they need to take into account about the new amendment?
So the way we see it is they need to ensure that they spend a lot more time and energy on sexual harassment training inside the workplace
Okay.
because companies who are found liable for any of those issues in future are not going to be eligible for their compliance certificate from the Department of Labor,
Oh, okay.
right? Other things they need to consider is minimum wage. That's an easy one. You know if you pay minimum wage or not. Um, but another area we've identified that's going to need attention is job grading,
Job grading. What do you mean by that?
right? Because you're going to need to ensure that um, because equal if you have to ensure that women and men are paid equally,
Okay.
right? So how one of the ways we think is ideal to do that is by ensuring you do a job grading exercise internally to make sure that everybody is on par and you can protect yourself if you ever get any issues around that. Um, so what that looks like, if you're not compliant with that, is you will lose your employment equity compliance certificate and you will not be able to do business with any government department. We anticipate that in the same way, when BE was first introduced, it was only government departments that initially implemented it, and then larger corporates, and then it filtered down to medium and smaller businesses
Mm-mm.
who would then all have BE policies for their procurement. So we anticipate the same will happen with um, the employment equity compliance in that it's going to start with government and then larger corporates will probably say the same and then so will smaller businesses as it will filter down where if you do not have your employment equity compliance certificate, you will not be able to do any business. So that means that your compliance inside your business from an HR perspective becomes critical.
Oh, okay, I see, I see. And pertaining sectoral targets, I know you touched on it briefly, but I want to get into like the legal binding aspect of it. Can you speak to me on that?
So the Department of Labor has been fair and they've given everybody an out, so to speak,
An out.
an out,
Okay.
right? So if you can provide justifiable reasons for not being able to reach the targets in the timelines, but these justifiable reasons have to be solid and you have to prove with a lot of evidence that you tried everything you could, you can still avoid meeting those sectoral targets and you can still be considered compliant. However, I would recommend be very careful with that because you are likely going to have to defend yourself very hard against it. So what the Department of Labor would like to see instead is that you focus internally
Mm.
on growing your own timber, so to speak, right? So establish where the gaps are inside your business. And one way to do that is a skills audit. So by perhaps means of a skills audit, establish what skills are lacking for where
Okay.
you want your business to go and how you want it to grow, and use that to then determine how you can meet the sectoral targets.
Oh, okay.
Um, because then you can figure out which people you need in which positions over
Mm.
the course of those 5 years, and you can develop those people into those positions that you want them to go into. And if you're really smart about it, you'll integrate your WSP submission, your workplace skills plan, and your annual training report submissions to your CETA with that. And if you're even smarter about it, you'll also integrate your BE strategy with that because what you'd be able to do then is take your skills target on your BE element.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, on your skills element, you can take that spend target
Yeah.
and you can leverage that
Mm.
into the areas you've identified from your skills audit that take your business to where you need it to grow and where you want it to grow in order to help you reach those sectoral targets.
What stops employers from hiring externally as opposed to improving internally?
Well, nothing.
Mm-mm.
You can still do that
Yeah,
as long
yeah.
as you align as much as you can with the targets anyway.
Mm-mm. And I saw you spoke about how the employment equity aligns with triple BE strategies. Can you just speak to me more on that? I don't think I understood it quite well. So can you just break it down for me again?
Sure. So there are three pieces of transformation legislation that
Yeah.
sit in different departments,
Mm-hmm.
but are ultimately all integrated.
Okay.
So the first one is the BE Act, and it has multiple sector codes attached to it. The Employment Equity Act, and in fact, let me backtrack. The BE Act sits under the auspices of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition,
Okay.
and the BE Commission has an oversight role of compliance thereof, right?
Okay.
Then you have the Employment Equity Act, um, which requires an annual submission to the Department of Labor.
Mm-hmm.
BE is optional, by the way. You can
Oh, okay.
choose whether or not to comply with it.
Yeah.
You may not have access to certain opportunities if you don't comply with it, but it's still optional. Employment equity is not optional, it's mandatory.
Yes.
Non-compliance of employment equity legislation can attract a 1.5 million rand fine
Yes.
or a percentage of your turnover, even for a first-time offense, and potentially even a criminal record. Um,
Oh, yeah, we did speak about that off camera. We spoke about like the potential incarceration, and do you think that's a valid sanction?
um, I, this is just my guess. I would assume government needed to show it had teeth on employment equity. And how do you
Okay.
do that? You scare people into compliance by threatening uh, incarceration. I
Yes.
don't know personally of anybody who's been incarcerated for employment equity. Maybe somebody else out there does. Um,
Mm,
but a criminal record doesn't necessarily have to equal incarceration, by the way.
mm.
But yeah, so so employment equity has teeth. BE doesn't. B is mandatory. B is an incentive.
Yes.
B is a carrot. Employment equity is a stick.
Okay.
And then the third piece of transformation legislation is the Skills Development Act and its submissions to your CETA.
Oh, okay.
So those three, the BE, the employment equity, and the skills development, are three pieces of transformation legislation that all link in together, even though their compliance sits in different places and
In the sense
different.
that there are different sanctions and one's mandatory, one isn't, and okay, I see that.
So skills is also optional.
Okay.
However, if you want to be BE compliant, you must have your skills compliance in order.
Oh, okay.
So they sort of they cut across and they depend on each other.
So, from my understanding, so there's company A, right? Company A has certain targets that they need to reach, right? Sectoral targets that they need to reach. And in order to reach those, there's skills development that they need to initiate. And through those skills development initiatives, they incidentally, what's it called, improve their triple BE scorecard rating.
Well, excuse me, I wouldn't say incidentally. Usually the BE scorecard would be the driver behind
The
it
driver behind it,
because
okay?
that would be the decided on by the target score a company needs to achieve.
Okay,
So I would suggest that the other legislation supports the BE. The BE is the main driver of it.
okay. So
But
the umbrella basically.
yeah, because ultimately everything pulls into your BE scorecard
True, true,
at
true.
the end of the day. And I mean, and the solutions I've provided here are not the holy grail.
Okay.
Somebody else may have a different way that they want to approach compliance. But our preference is, if you're serious about your business, you want to do things properly. One of the ways to do things properly is the way I've recommended.
And just to close off, just say everything works out with regards to everyone reaching their sectoral targets. What would that look like in 2030 and maybe moving forward?
I don't think that's realistic, actually.
Okay.
I don't think everybody's going to magically reach their sectoral targets in 5 years, and there's a number of reasons for that.
Mm.
Part of it is there isn't sufficient pipeline available, and there's multiple reasons for that. We can't give government a get out of jail free card because they are part of the problem.
Sufficient pipeline with regards to talent recruitment.
Correct, yes.
So what role does how's the government sort of created a barrier to that?
Let's look at dropout rates from by the time somebody started grade 1 to the time they matriculate. Dropout rate is, I'm not going to try to remember what it is,
Yeah.
but you can Google it quite easily. It's quite bad. Um, and then once they start university, many can't even read for meaning properly at that point. So how are they supposed to be effective university students so that they can eventually come out of that pipeline to enter the greater workforce? So government has been very unfair by passing that burden onto business
Yeah, corporate
to
South
say,
Africa, yeah.
we messed up, but screw you. You get to deal with the problems that we created,
Okay.
and we're going to make it worse for you and harder for you while we're at it.
Okay.
So it's you're not going to solve the problem in 5 years. The SETAs in principle are a brilliant idea,
Yes.
but as with most government good ideas, execution is usually not very well done at all. I've been to South Korea. South Korea, I've been there twice actually, and it's an incredible experience, incredible place to see. What they got right is they focused so heavily on education that by educating their population to the incredibly high degree that they did, they've been able to grow their country from the poorest nation in the world in one lifetime, right? There are people who were born when South Korea was the poorest nation in the world. It's now one of the wealthiest industrialized nations in the world. How do they do it? They focused on education. So I think that's what government was trying to do, was to use education to help us improve the lives of people in South Africa. It's just unfortunately our government cannot operate nearly as effectively as the South Korean government can, and so it's largely failed. I'm generally not impressed with the kind of outcomes you get from most SETA programs. Not all.
So I guess the SETA programs come too late. The education is supposed to come from a foundational phase
Early
and then
childhood
early
development,
childhood
start
development.
there,
Yeah.
right? That's actually where the problem needs to be fixed. And then all the way through that learning chain. By the time they've matriculated or dropped out of school, it's so hard
Yeah.
to fix those problems.
They've already progressed heavily. So in that sense, would you say the amendment of the Employment Equity Act is sort of like a plaster to a deeper hole?
Yes, actually, as much as I understand why government is driving the agenda because it's not seeing sufficient transformation, like I said, government also has to accept its liability in this, and they have to realize that if they did better, they would actually help business get better outcomes on the very targets that government wants to see business achieve.
As opposed to just like dispersing with the responsibility and not taking accountability.
Correct.
Fantastic. Lee, thank you so much for joining us. This was very insightful. To our viewers, thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe.